Hello everyone, my name is Pearlescent Moon and welcome back to week 9 of my Minecraft ABuildADay challenge. For anyone new to this challenge, the basic idea is that I create at least one build per day for a full 365 or 366 day duration. Now I will add a quick note here that due to work pressures in the midst of said challenge, this has transitioned more to ABuildADay without any specific duration in mind, as long as the build is done in one singular day. The theme for this week delved into creating temples for different Minecraft biomes. If you would like to download the builds shown in this video, please check the description for more details where I provide instructions there. Much love to you all, and with all that said, let's get into day 57. To begin the week, I started out in the most underrated dimension of them all, the end. Unfortunately, I streamed this build over on Twitch and had forgotten to press the record button for replay mode, so I am missing our valuable time-lapse footage. Regardless, I will try my best to continue to explain the thought process as we check out an overview of the build in the background. My apologies, guys. As usual, I did start this one by marking out my base shape with cubes or rectangular prisms to ensure the composition was how I wanted it. If a spot felt out of balance, I would add more on the sides to give a sign of balanced asymmetry. Adding a diagonal piece on the left-hand side allowed the overall build to feel more dynamic, over a stiff 90-degree positioning, and provided more flow to the general viewpoint of the build itself. This step in the process is always handy for me to sketch out the shape first, without worrying too much about the fine details. Now of course, palette-wise, I wanted to go for that purple contrast commonly found in the end dimension. So I chose blue terracotta, that seems to appear more purple, alongside a range of white blocks and one of the most underused blocks in the game, purple. It's also not exactly my favourite block, but you know, it's okay. I felt like it was super important to at least give purple some love, considering it stems from the very dimension I would be making the temple in. In the end, I think it worked quite well as a highlight and became a nice balance between the stark white tints and darker shades. Some black terracotta bordered with some spruce wood logs allowed an extra palette element for the foundational base on this particular build. I'm not even really sure what style this structure is influenced from, but that conceptual temple art vibe seems to fit with the location it's in. For the small detail side of things, I simply utilised stairs in a few directions to give the build a tad bit of extra shape, as well as upside down purple stairs for railings on the bridge in the middle. Sea lanterns also worked quite well behind purple glass to give the window looking segments a little bit of ominous light, especially in nighttime situations, despite the end dimension having no day and night cycle. Let's just imagine things here. As some final touches, sandstone on the ground with some birch planks as shading worked well as a subtle path that stood apart from the end stone, and some cute little gardens were added with mycelium, chorus plants, and dried coral. The most dangerous part of this build would have had to have been the end crystals that I dotted around for a fancy addition. No real reason. I'm not 100% sure about the water that I added in this build, but definitely something to think about next time I attempt another end temple. Now the beach biome needed some love, so for day 58 I created a temple focusing on more of a palm or tropical vibe. To start this one off, I grabbed a slice of vanilla mountain terrain and used it as a base segment for me to chuck the structure itself onto. As usual, I began with my wireframe sketch, as I like to call it, in placeholder blocks that stand clearly separate from the land surrounding it. I love the dome style of structure, so it became the main focus of this particular temple. Regarding that, anything built on this segment sprouts from that center section. It appears as the dominant feature in this build, yet is complemented and contrasted with rectangular pieces that I've attached to the sides and built up around it. The gold blocks represent a base foundation for the build to sit on and is wider than the pieces on top, so it may support the visualized weight. The typical dome structure is supported by pillars, dotted around the outside circle, with even spaces in between them, and extra shapes are piled on top to balance the round nature of the hemisphere roof. Adding in those slightly inclined roof pieces on top of the dome itself also adds that extra shape into the mix for increased decorative interest. Palette-wise, I decided to go for a slightly green and sandy colour scheme, depicting the slight moss shade with prismarine and green blocks, and wood variants with granite and hardened clay, giving off more of the dirty, wet sand look. Grey shades made up the base foundation for strength, with the terrain maintaining our beautiful vanilla sand to contrast the build and match with our biome of choice. As a slightly later addition during the palette choice, I did add that small tower off to the left, as I felt the main base of the build was quite heavy and dominating the right side of the plot. This helps balance the build in its place without drawing too much attention away from the focus point. To complete the scene, I made some palm trees for greenery and dotted a few rocks around the terrain with birch planks mixed into the sand for a bit of shading detail on the ground, kind of like the end build in the last one. 59 focused on the neighbour to the beach biome, the desert biome. For this one, I decided to try a take influenced by the Arabian style of architecture. Overall, I felt it was a slightly squishy result, and I believe I could have evaluated the composition a little better, but it wasn't necessarily a bad result. It is certainly something to learn from next time I attempt something of the sort. Maybe it could be scaled up a little bit more. Maybe. Regardless, I started out by building up the base plate terrain with a slightly sloped sand base to resemble a sand dune. Building atop that, I went with a cylindrical base shape topped off with onion dome-shaped roofs. I essentially followed the same outline for the whole structure as I added more cylinders around the bulk of the build. I did keep it fairly symmetrical on the main segment, however I did add small structural pieces and archways off the side to create some asymmetry instead. The palette consisted of very vibrant yellows to contrast the sand. However, even now looking back on it, I probably could have tried some complementary colours to really make it pop. The monochromatic look does work, but there's so many different things you can trial with palettes to try a whole new atmosphere on a build. Now, just a quick mention, I will go into colour palettes in a video coming on this channel down the line. I think that will be a lot of fun. For the terrain, I added small water reservoirs down the right hand side, some dotted rocks just like our beach temple, and then made some new tall and fluffy palm trees to spread around. I added some desert cacti and some dead coral on top of the rocks by the water to add a bit of nice texture. The final piece to bring together the scene was this small S-shaped snake statue on top of a pillar for some symbol identification on the temple itself. Now, the jungle temple was probably a concept I struggled with the most, aside from an ice and snow one down the line. I wanted to steer away from the usual Aztec or Mayan temple style that would be made in this instance and tried to make something of my own influence. Unfortunately, this didn't really work out how I wanted it to. I tried to create some sort of small temple vibe by creating a cube-based shape for the structure with a covered walkway off to the side that wrapped around the scene. I think in general this concept might have worked out a bit better if it was on a larger scale, but with the plot restrictions I kept myself to, it was just too big of an aspiration to fit any proper detail that I wanted. I kept the palette very natural with brown walls, grey roofs, and a super overgrown scene around it that enveloped the structure itself. Complete the build with a fire pit and 2 large, custom jungle trees, and we can move on from this one. Not every build is going to be one I'm happy with, but this challenge brings out your creativity alongside trial and error. I think next time I attempt the jungle temple, I can take this one as an influence and make it even better. Keep your old builds, don't get rid of them. You might find them handy to look back on. Day 61 was probably my favourite build out of the whole week that I had made. For this one, I focused on a Japanese temple structure style and attempted to replicate some of the small details found in these buildings while being limited to my chosen plot size. As usual, I started out making my base plate, which was a simple light sloped stone chunk of terrain. I think something like this could also work on a really steep slope as well, as many Japanese temples and shrines are on the sides of mountains and steep locations, as well as in the open on flat land. Steep stairs leading up to these buildings are also quite common, as I experienced on my trip to Japan back in 2018. Regardless, once I had a solid section of land to build on, I began by marking out my basic composition and the structural foundations. I decided to go with 2 small temples instead of 1 large one, as it just made it feel more like a small scene, rather than just focusing on a singular large structure. Finding influence from my own photos during my visit, as well as good old Google images of various temples around Japan, I added multiple large, wide-brimmed roofs around square-shaped structures, while keeping to a prismarine and orange base palette. Red blocks added some nice accents on the inner walls with white to contrast as I went. For detail, acacia trapdoors look like very fine-tuned railings around multiple levels of the temples on such a small scale alongside spruce gates for roof supports just above them. The roofs are shaped utilizing slabs for a light slope on the bottommost portions, with stairs on the higher areas to bring them to a sharper point, specifically on the smaller left-hand side temple. On the right, I created a unique horn type of detail atop the roof to resemble a curved hook detail, as can be found on the Heian Jingu Shrine in Kyoto. Given I exaggerated the detail quite a bit more than can be found in real life, but that is where my own flair came into play. Hanging lanterns aren't typically found where I've placed them in this particular architecture style either, but I like to add my own aesthetic into what I make alongside the roof pieces that I added. To pull the scene together, I used clay blocks on the ground to resemble a type of grey coloured sand, and added a patch of greenery on the right hand side. You'll typically find gardens that are well maintained around temples, so I wanted to bring a little bit of that to the build. Add a small pillar-like statue utilizing andesite walls for a small indented detail, and I can call this build complete. Designing a temple for the snow or ice biome was one of my least favourite builds of this week, as I'd mentioned with the jungle temple. I did start out with a vision in mind based on an ice pyramid and spike type of shape, but it didn't really turn out. Regardless, I started with the pyramid base and added a cylindrical form on top. I believe at the time I was thinking of giving it a large spiky roof, but visually in my mind it wasn't working out as I made progress, so I just kept it as a dome with a pointy bit of detail on the roof. I still wanted to use the ice spike biome as inspiration on the shape, so I added 4 spikes on each corner of the structure for some vertical design in the mix. To make the scene feel somewhat natural or overrun, I piled up the snow and ice on the sides so it merged a little with the terrain itself. To really bring the build together, I added small details like iron trapdoors on the sides for extra texture and shape alongside some diorite walls. The final day of week 9 ended with a temple focusing on real-life architecture from Thailand. Inspired by the marble temple in Bangkok, I began sketching out my own flair of shapes based off this building. Starting out with one big rectangular prism in the middle, I added 2 extra prisms off both sides and added a white structural foundation at the bottom for some extra shape. The marble temple itself consists of an orange and white colour palette with accents of gold throughout, so I kept that similar palette as I created my own version utilising white concrete, quartz, birch, sandstone, oak and orange sandstone as the main blocks, with others as accent pieces. The roof in the reference is quite a steep triangle shape that has a slight curve at the bottom, so I made my own shape with a combination of blocks and stairs, transitioning to slabs at the ends. Stairs were quite fun to use in this situation. I come up with a very delicate trim around the centre roof piece, and to add small curvy flicks on the adjacent sections. As a little bit of a note, this is not intended to be an exact replica, but rather an inspired style that uses elements of the building chosen. To tie a scene, I utilised the top texture of a blast furnace for a tiled pathway, and some green concrete powder to emulate well-kept grass sections. Clay in this situation worked similarly to the Japanese temple build for a clean path type of block on the ground closest to the temple. And iron trapdoors changed to a vertical position allowed me to also create a slim type of fence line around the main focus. If you're in creative mode, the debug stick will essentially change trapdoors for you without the use for redstone. If you're in survival, of course, you would have to use redstone or some sort to change that, or just don't use them. Up to you. And that's it. Week 9 is completed. I would say this week was one of the better weeks in terms of personal improvement and experimentation with multiple styles while creating my own flair. Don't be afraid to experiment with builds outside of your comfort zone, even if they don't turn out the way you wanted them to. They all contribute to the development of your skill set. Now once again, if you would like to download these builds, they are available to YouTube members, Twitch subscribers, or patrons through my Discord, all of which are linked below. Anyway, thank you all so much for watching and sticking around to watch me and my content. Much love, and I'll see you next time. Bye guys!